Hey students, Mr. Passeri here with an exciting video for the Google Classroom and YouTube channel going a bit more in depth on our weekly reading entitled The First President. Those of you who have turned in your last assignment overwhelmingly have gotten hundreds, so that's good. Keep up the good work, people. If you gave me nothing, either out of confusion in terms of how to attach something, let me know if you're confused. If you're just submitting blank documents thinking I won't check them, don't do that because then I can't give you a grade. But overwhelmingly, people are doing well, so keep up the good work. And without further ado, let's start going into a bit more detail in terms of our weekly topic, our weekly reading, our weekly questions. I see a lot of you have already submitted those questions. They're due Monday at 11:59 p.m., so you still have plenty of time to get them done. Let's start talking. So we are going to be talking about the first president and the challenges faced under his early years in office. As we know, the first president is George Washington. And again, the big issue facing the United States at this time is the need to balance central authority of the government and then also balance the need for personal freedom and respect for the different social and economic cultures of the different states and the people in them. Because as we know, particularly in the South, they have cash crops and a more farming-based way of life. In the North, you have more small shops, more fishing. There's farming, but it's not big farming. It's more based on food and local survival. So all of this is a challenge for the new United States government. George Washington is going to take office April 30th, 1789, and he is going to have John Adams as his vice president. Now, Adams is a good pick for vice president because he is a northern Bostonian lawyer. George Washington is a Virginia plantation owner war hero, and this is going to represent the different cultural perspectives of the North and the South. And it's also going to give good representation in terms of having a diversity of ideas, right? Because Washington is a general war hero, plantation owner, and Adams is a revolutionary and a lawyer. So this is a good, we have checks and balances in terms of the structure of the government, and you're going to have balance in terms of the authorities and the executive branch. Now, George Washington is going to be in a situation where what he does is going to become a pattern or a tradition. And the term for tradition that your book uses is precedent, okay? So precedents are traditions that people are expected to follow because people in power practice those traditions. And they end up becoming unspoken rules, and then sometimes there's a need to actually put those rules in legal form. Now, one major tradition that George Washington is going to put in place is a cabinet. Okay, there's other important traditions too, like an inaugural address where he addresses the country after he takes office, having 2 terms in office, which is not actually a law at this time. It's just kind of like a gentlemanly agreement without actually being in writing. And at least on paper, although this is, more the letter, more on paper than in reality, the idea of neutrality, not getting involved in European affairs, not getting tangled in dangerous alliances. Now, that's the reason I say that it's more on paper is because the United States absolutely has imperial interests, even from the get-go. I mean, there's Canada, there's Spanish Florida, there's native lands, so it's not like they're going to be isolated in terms of their foreign policy, but there's also the important idea of Washington does not want to get tangled up in foreign treaties that are going to drag the United States into wars that it has no real interest in being in. So back to precedents, a really important precedent that Washington creates is a cabinet. And this is actually really smart because Washington is smart enough to, A, not present himself as the sole authority figure because people are already afraid that he's going to be like a king, and B, to have people advising him on issues that he's not an expert on, right? So he's going to appoint other revolutionary leaders that he can trust, that he knows are competent in these areas, that he's friends with in these positions of authority. Because Washington, his area of expertise is primarily, war and foreign policy, because he was a general, he was a soldier, he was involved in international affairs. He doesn't know that much about running the economy, and he's got to be running the country, so he's got to have someone good for diplomacy. So he has to appoint other people who are better at these specific tasks than he is. So a really important person that he chooses to head the State Department, which is really going to be dealing a lot with diplomacy and foreign relations, is Thomas Jefferson. Now, you know that Thomas Jefferson was something of a Francophile, which is a fancy way to say he loved France. So that is a good pick. He is a revolutionary leader, philosopher, and he is the person who is largely credited with the Declaration of Independence. And since France played such a big role as a U.S. ally in the Revolution, Jefferson is a good pick for that. You have a young soldier, a young financial, expert, so to speak, Alexander Hamilton. People have more recently started to learn about Alexander Hamilton thanks to the Broadway play that came out a few years ago. I know Kalia is a big fan of that play. I know Mr. Chapin is not a fan of Alexander Hamilton. But Alexander Hamilton is put in charge of the Treasury, and he's actually going to do some things that are really going to help the United States get out of the hole economically that they're in. And some of the things that he does are going to be kind of backwards in our logic. So, for example, the United States is in debt, and Alexander Hamilton's solution to that is to drive up more debt. But there is a method to his madness, namely to pay off certain debts and then drive up another big national debt to keep borrowing money that the United States can use, but then also make it in the interest of the United States debtors that the United States actually succeeds. And so that's kind of Alexander Hamilton's plan. And he's got to be in a situation where he's going to have to try to get all of the states to cooperate with his plan, which is going to be very difficult because there's people, particularly in the South, that don't really have a lot of debt. And my wife is dancing off in the distance here, which is a thing that's happening right now that I'm seeing. Some good stuff. All right. So anyway, all right, good deal. Have some coffee after that. All right. So anyway, so moving on. So the president has a cabinet. He has various people in charge of said positions. And one of the people that he is going to put in a position of power is John Jay. And he is going to have him lead the Supreme Court. And again, the Supreme Court is a branch of government that is involved in giving the definitive legal answer on an issue. So again, that is very, very important. Back to Alexander Hamilton. I'm just looking through your questions. He was 34 years old, so he's a few years younger than me when he took office. So he beat me to national prominence. So good for him. So here's this is kind of interesting here. This is the last bit of things covered in your reading here. Let's talk more about Alexander Hamilton's plan to get the economy back on its feet. Okay. The United States was in massive debt after the Revolutionary War. A lot of individual citizens were in debt. The new government was in debt. Southern states actually did pretty well and did not need to go into much debt because their plantations were profitable. A lot of the war early on was fought more in the north. There's various issues. The southern states were not really in as much debt as the northern states. What ended up happening was Alexander Hamilton's plan was essentially to get the countries that the United States owed money to, pay off those countries, and also he wanted to, before running up a new debt, to pay back the bonds that were owed to the American people. There's now a bond is a paper note promising money to be repaid in a certain amount of time, and governments will basically ask citizens for financial support during times of war to help out the war effort, and then they'll say we'll pay you back with extra money, okay, with interest. Now the problem is that there were people called speculators, and when the economy was really bad after the war, speculators would go around and buy up people's bonds with the idea that, you know, these bonds are going to get paid eventually and I'll get the profit. These people are desperate right now. They might not think they're going to get repaid. I'm going to take a gamble, buy these bonds from these poor people that need money immediately to survive, and that's, you know, what a speculator would do. The people that are going to get paid back when Alexander Hamilton pays back those bonds are going to be the speculators. That's going to make a lot of people who sold their bonds to the speculators incredibly unhappy, because that was money that was owed to them, and out of desperation, they sold it. So that's an important thing to note. Now, here's the deal. Like I said, southern states were not in debt, but a lot of northern states had a lot of debt, and the country as a whole needed to pay off debts to other foreign countries that helped the United States during the Revolutionary War. So, what Alexander Hamilton did to make southern states less annoyed at him was to put the nation's capital in the South. And that is why we have Washington, D.C. We originally have the capital in New York, then that capital moves to Philadelphia, and then from Philadelphia, the capital is going to move to Washington, D.C., which is going to be right next to Maryland and Virginia. And that is why Washington, D.C. is where it is. Now, Alexander Hamilton is also going to propose a national bank. Jefferson and Madison are two big kind of philosopher, scholar, early leaders, both Southern plantation owners. They are going to be against the national bank because they feel it's going to be unconstitutional. There's literally nothing in the Constitution that says, hey, the government can make its own bank. And they also felt that that bank was going to be used as a tool to benefit the wealthy. Now, truth be told, the United States is crafted by white, wealthy, older men, but Jefferson and Madison thought that this was going a bit too far, that this was starting to undercut the democratic principles that more capable set of wealthy men agreed to. Now we're going to start getting too much central power, basically. Because people like Jefferson aired much more on the side of wanting more power in the states than in the hands of the central government, of the federal government. Okay, the term unconstitutional means that it is inconsistent with the Constitution. There was the word tariff that was used in your reading, and that is a tax on imports. Now, southern states are not going to like tariffs, because southern states export a lot of goods. That's the name of their economy, is exporting stuff that they make through slave labor. Now, what ends up happening is if a good gets imported to the United States and the government wants to make money on that good by putting a tax on that good so that the country that's exporting that is going to end up losing money, that country that's doing the exporting to the United States will be mad at the United States and put a tariff on exports of the United States. So who's exporting from the United States? The South. So automatically, this is going to start being an issue in the South that's going to start really annoying Southern leaders, Southern plantation owners, Southern citizens, is the issue of tariffs. Because when the United States government puts tariffs on foreign goods, the counter tariffs go on Southern exports. So just be aware of that. And your final question on your work was, why was Hamilton in favor of national taxes? Again, to help the government pay off their national debt. That's kind of the big picture of your reading this week. This one was a bit more specific. Last week we got to talk a bit more about philosophical concepts. The big takeaways from this week's reading, again, are balancing federal power and state power, and also the ideas of what are the traditions that the executive branch creates, and what were some of the early challenges that the president's cabinet dealt with. So there you have it. Your work is due on Monday. Hope you're all staying well, and until next time, I'm Mr. Passeri. I'll see you in the very near future. Oh, and Santino's awake. Right on cue. Bye-bye.